Okay, so basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to essentially just speak mostly about the article that I wrote on this topic, which is on materialism, subjectivity, and dialectics or dialectical thinking. I'm going to first briefly discuss Quentin Milius's notion of correlationism, which some of you may be familiar with. And then I'm going to kind of point to a problem with it that I think is there and it is unavoidable. And then I'm going to propose a possible, a possible reading of dialectical materialism through Hegel and Marx. Now, by dialectical materialism, I don't mean the way the 20th century has thought about this term, which is, I mean, the term dialectical materialism has its own history. So I'm not too concerned with the kind of historical understanding of the term, and I'm not using it in any special sense. And I hope by the end of the presentation you'll know what I mean when I say a materialism that is dialectical. And what I mean by that is it's a form of materialism that incorporates subjectivity and conceptual thinking within itself. It doesn't try to, let's say, decenter or dismiss or negate those things. But hopefully this will become a bit more clear in the presentation. And if at any point my audio isn't good or you think there's some technical difficulties, please let me know and I'll try to troubleshoot it and sort it out, because I am speaking on an iPhone, which is still a bit bizarre for me. Okay. So in his famous text, After Finitude, Milius puts forward what he calls correlationism. And correlationism, for Milius, refers to any philosophical position or orientation that insists on the inescapable nature of the correlate between thought and being. For Milius, correlationism maintains that the entanglement or this inescapability between what is and the activity of thought is unavoidable. Hence the name correlation. Once we think one, we think the other, for Milius. So you can't separate the two things. Ontology and thinking are one and the same process, and this is what Milius calls correlationism. For a correlationist thinker, according to Milius, we do not have access to the realm of things as they exist independently of our experience and cognition of them. So, for example, Kant's thing in itself. We only ever have access to being, that is, to what is, insofar as this being accords with or is in some sense reducible to thought. In this respect, for Milius, modern philosophy, to the extent that it upholds the Kantian model, has, and this is a quote from Milius's text, he says, quote, lost the great outdoors, lost the absolute outside of pre-critical thinkers, end quote. Milius's arche-fossil, this is another term he introduces, refers to ancient material or ancient objects whose existence predates not only the emergence of human beings as a species, but also predates givenness as such. And by givenness, he simply just means that which is given to a consciousness. So for Milius, the arche-fossil is, and this is another quote, a givenness of being that is anterior to givenness itself, end quote. So for him, for Milius, the arche-fossil poses a problem for the correlationist thinker because he thinks it necessarily forces the correlationist thinker and everyone else to think outside the confines and the limitations of human subjectivity. The archaic fossil predates the subject in a very empirical, real way. In this sense, then, Milius's speculative materialism, as he calls it, insofar as it attempts to go beyond any conceptual mediation through subjectivity, when accessing being qua being, is a philosophy. So Milius's philosophy is one that decenters the category of the subject, or so he claims, and with it, subjective experience. But I think there's a problem here. So this was a very brief, very brief summary of Milius's kind of position, or his criticism of Kantian and post-Kantian philosophy. But I do think there's a bit of an issue here, right? Because I think there's a self-reflexivity or a self-awareness at work in Milius's claim, which he himself does not acknowledge, at least not explicitly in his text. So what I mean by this is terms such as givenness, archaic fossil, relationality, subject, object, outside, and so on and so forth. All of these are, of course, concepts, or what Hegel called thought determinations. And these concepts refer to various things, ideas, moments, events, and so on. Even the terms thinking and being are concepts and are categories that we use. And the concepts that we use when we think. So there's a strange contradiction here, at least I think so. Because on the one hand, Milius's attempt is to go beyond the subject, go beyond thought, get at the great outdoors, and so on. But the point that I'm trying to make is that he, and I sort of said this last week as well, and so far as philosophers philosophize and think and use concepts, then their own position, their own subject position is, let's say, baked into their philosophy, whether they admit it or not. So the materialist who says, my materialism isn't dependent upon any kind of notion of subjectivity, that statement itself is what is known as now a performative contradiction. The claim contradicts the one who utters the claim, if you see what I mean, or vice versa. The one who speaks, who makes a claim that is non-subjective or not reliant upon a subject, contradicts him or herself. So the contradiction is that the very attempt to separate thought and being, which is what Milius wants to do, in order to go beyond or get outside of the subject, engenders a dialectical process that necessarily involves conceptual determinations that are, of course, only intelligible to us as thinking subjects. In other words, there is no meta-language. There is no meta-position that one could take and say, I'm doing philosophy that has nothing to do with the subject, because you are a subject. This is my point. And so far as we remain human subjects, in some sense, there is no outside position from which to think the other than human, because our conceptualization of what is and of what is other in relation to us necessarily recoils back to us, refers back to our own activity of thinking. This is what I mean by self-reflexivity. So our quest to think the other than human or the other than thought will necessarily involve thought, because we're thinking about it. And insofar as we think, we use concepts, and insofar as we use concepts, we remain subjects. So if you remember, if you were here last week, Hegel sort of makes this point, and this was the last thing that I sort of said last week when Hegel points out that there's no real opposition between idealism and realism. Because for Hegel, all philosophy at base is an idealism. It has concepts. It uses concepts. So the point here is that all thinking is nothing but conceptualization. And so far as it grasps conceptual determinations that structure and engender thought. To this extent, to conceptualize, for Hegel, is the primordial ground of all thinking and of all philosophy. So a realist philosophy that is predicated on concepts such as matter or atoms or whatever you like, these are for Hegel, as we saw last week, conceptual idealizations that are posited in the activity of thought. But there's an important point to make here, and that is that Hegel points out that these idealizations remain representations or picture thoughts. They exist as what he calls imaginary constructs within the subject. And this is a problem, and Hegel doesn't like this, because what it means is you're left with what he calls a subjective idealism. And I spoke about this a bit last week. This essentially is so for Hegel, this is what Fichte and Kant are doing, is that they're subjective idealists because they ground everything within representational thinking. And for Hegel, this is one-sided and it's incomplete. So for a subjective idealist or a subjective idealist philosophy remains fixed within the confines of representations, and in a sense, it can't get out of that bind. The subjective idealist's concern is only the form of representations, and it remains indifferent to their content. So if you know anything about Kant gives you 12 categories that are pure, empty categories that are formal categories of the understanding, which we use to then have experiences. Essentially, the sense data we get need to accord with these categories, and we make sense of our reality for Kant. They remain formal. But Hegel thinks this isn't enough. So, if we are to avoid a relapse into a Kantianism or a subjective idealism, then if we still want to be materialists, which I think we do, at least I want to, then we need a properly conceptually consistent account of materialism, one that does not and cannot remain silent about its idealist foundations. In other words, we can't be satisfied, I think, with Méliès's version of materialism. So materialism's reliance on concepts can no longer stay secret, but must be openly declared and proudly affirmed, I think. But this affirmation does not entail a reduction of the objective world outside of the subject to mere concepts that are simply subsumed within a subjective mind. This is not what I'm saying, right? So I'm not saying, yes, we can have the external world, but let it all be predicated on the transcendental subject, which would be sort of like Kant's position. The acknowledgement of the constitutive role played by the conceptual determinations inherent in thought and being does not preclude a materialism, provided that the type of materialism we subscribe to and affirm is dialectical in its logic. And this is the position that I'll be explaining in a bit more detail. So Frank Ruda has recently argued that the traditional split in philosophy between idealism and materialism has, in the last 10, 15 years, reappeared within materialism itself. Namely, this split, according to Ruda, is how he understands Alain Badiou's distinction between what Badiou calls, on the one hand, dialectical materialism, and on the other hand, democratic materialism. For Ruda, the important difference between the two is that dialectical materialism openly recognizes and acknowledges the idealism within its conceptual framework, whereas democratic materialism or other forms of materialisms do not. So Ruda calls dialectical materialism materialism with idealism. And he says democratic materialism can be thought of as materialisms without idealism. But I want to tweak this a little bit here, and I want to go a bit further, because I don't think that democratic materialists or someone like Milieu don't have any idealism in their philosophy. They do. Milieu does, which is what I was just trying to point out. He just doesn't acknowledge it, or he isn't done. Basically, Milieu is in denial about his idealism. He needs to go to Freudian psychoanalysis to stop repressing the denial. So I would say something like, okay, yes, dialectical materialism is materialism with idealism, but I would say a democratic materialism, or the other type of materialism, is a materialism in denial of its own idealist foundations. This would be my tweak to Frank Ruda's point. And in another formulation, Žižek recently argued that we can think of dialectical materialism as materialism with an idea. So it openly kind of asserts the role of ideas, or the idea, in its materialist philosophy. So my argument, in case you're wondering what it is I'm actually arguing here, is that the dialectical infinite activity of becoming that constitutes the absolute idea, which is Hegel's term, creates or engenders a materialism that avoids this self-reflexive or performative contradiction, which I pointed to earlier, which I think Milieu has, but he doesn't acknowledge. I think this dialectical materialism avoids this by virtue of its unification of the concept or the subject with objectivity. So essentially my argument is Hegel's absolute idea is the sort of idea we need to have a materialism that is, in a sense, not afraid to be, well, not afraid of contradictions, let me put it that way. So I'm gonna cover 3 broad points throughout the rest of the talk. The first point is that I think Hegel's positing the presuppositions thesis confirms that conceptualization is always already present in our activity of thinking. That's the first thing I'm going to explain. Second, the movement from the particular to the universal in the Hegelian concept guarantees that ontology and thought are inseparable. Third, Hegel's absolute idea moves towards a dialectical conception of materialism that does not reproduce the contradictions and the self-reflexive failings, let me put it this way, of non-dialectical materialisms. So that's the final point. And with this final point, this is where Marx comes in. So I will be speaking about Marx eventually. Okay. So the first thing, which is Hegel's positing the presuppositions thesis. The very notion that concepts are tools that we use in the act of thinking is ridiculous for Hegel. That is, concepts are not tools, they're not instruments, right? And so Hegel kind of points out this problem, you know, by saying that concepts are tools that we use to think. He says this is analogous to saying, and this is Hegel in a letter, he says, quote, "This is like saying that chewing and swallowing food were a mere means of eating." And Hegel goes on to say, as if the understanding still did much else besides thinking. So this is an important point, but I'm going to kind of go over it again. The point here is that concepts are not distinct from thinking. right? It's not that we can think different things and there's concepts on the one hand that we can use as tools and we can think without concepts. For Hegel, whenever you're thinking, you're conceptualizing, and there's no way to think without conceptualizing, right? Again, that would be analogous to claiming that eating is different than chewing and swallowing food, right? For Hegel, this is an absurd thing to say. So conceptualization and the use of concepts are what thinking is for Hegel. Thinking is nothing but using concepts. So they're not instruments, right? They're not tools. They're not means by which we think. They are thinking itself. Concepts, and so the act of using concepts is constitutive of the very act of thinking. The two things are identical. So we could say this another way: insofar as thinking is an activity or a process, it is an activity of conceiving or of conceptualization. So in this respect, conceiving and thinking are identical for Hegel. Or to put it another way, they are the self-same or the self-identical movement wherein the concept as infinite form embodies any and all content. There's an imminent inescapability to conceiving. Whenever we think, we implicitly posit conceptual determinations that determine the structure and content of what we think. We think in and through concepts, regardless of the topic at hand. Imminent to thought are conceptual determinations. And this is what Hegel means when he claims that we posit the conceptual presuppositions whenever we think. Now this term posit, or to posit, in some sense, one of the German meanings of this term is to presuppose or to posit in advance. So to posit is always already to constitute a negative conceptual determination as a presupposition. So, for example, take the law of causality. As a physical law, the cause posits its effect. Conceptually, however, it is the effect that posits its cause as a presupposition that imminently determines the effect itself. This is just a conceptual example of positing. It's not meant to be a law of physics, right? So let me just go over that again, if that might be easier. So in strictly physical terms, okay, the cause posits the effect, and we can kind of draw a chain of causality and make sense of it. Great. But for Hegel, conceptually, it's the other way around. The effect posits its cause as its own presupposition, which then determines itself as the effect, if you see what I mean. The conceptual determination, that is the cause in this example, is identified retroactively through the content of the effect. Conceptual determination is reflective in this sense, in that it turns or recoils back to itself. It refers to itself. So when we think of anything, whatever, we posit conceptual determinations that construct the very form and content of what we think. Here's another example. It's a bit of a stupid example. It's in the essay that I wrote in the chapter, but whatever. So when I think of my cat, I very well have a specific particular animal in mind. I know which cat I'm thinking of, right? I'm not thinking about Felix the cat or Garfield or any other cat. I'm thinking about my cat, the concept I have of my cat. The thought I have of this cat accords to the animal that I'm thinking of. The signifier refers to the specific signified, if we want to think about it this way. However, the thought, quote unquote, my cat, not only relies on the universal concept of cat and possession, but these concepts determine the very content and composition of the very thought, my cat. So the universality of the concept cat, so the genus cat, is also a universal concept for Hegel. But this universality emerges through its other, that is, through the particular experience of a cat. So when I posit or assert a thought, I simultaneously presuppose the concepts necessary for me to generate this thought and render it intelligible. The concept then is universality as such. It is not a universal amongst other universals. And so when I say the concept, I mean the concept of the concept. You know, Hegel's concept of the concept, which is the universal concept of all concepts. So the relation between the object as a particular thing and the concept as a concrete universal is a negative relation or a negative determination. In expressing a particular entity, say this cat, we simultaneously express a universal, right? So the point here is even when I'm thinking of or referring to a specific particular thing, for example, my cat, embedded within that particular concept is the universal concept of cat, which encompasses all cats, if you see what I mean. And Hegel's point is the way we obtain what he calls a concrete universal is through the particular. So it's not that I have to abstract from this particular cat to have a abstract universal category of all cats. It's the other way around for Hegel. It's only through the particular example that I can get at the concrete universal. So to put the point a bit stronger, when I'm thinking of and referring to a very specific cat or a very specific book or novel, whatever you want, when I'm thinking of or referring to or expressing a particular thing, I am in a negative sense because I'm not positing this, but I'm also, let me put it this way, when I refer or posit a particular, I also negatively express and presuppose a universal. So within this framework, presuppositions operate as negative determinations that structure and shape the very being of our thinking. So it is this self-reflexive nature of the activity of thinking which what Hegel calls the absolute idea encompasses and at the same time exposes. To think is to conceive. The concept for Hegel is self-explanatory. That is to say, what is explained and that which is the explanation are identical. So if I want to explain what my cat is doing, I'm of course referring to the animal that is doing something over there. But conceptually, I'm using concepts. I'm using concepts to explain what my cat is doing. So I'm using concepts to explain something that is also conceptual. So you see the point here. The point is that they're concepts through and through. Even when we're referring to things that are outside of us as subjects. But the explanation or the explication of any thought whatsoever, through this, the concept explicates itself by virtue of the employment of concepts in the activity of thinking. However, rather than simply having discursive import, the logic of the concept is ontologically constitutive of reality. So up until this point, everything I've said makes it sound like for Hegel, the concept is only something that we think about and is wedded to us as thinking beings. It's identical with thought. But that's not the end of the story, right? If Hegel stopped here, he would still be a Kantian. He would still be Fichte. He would still be a subjective idealist. But of course, for Hegel, the absolute idea doesn't really remain or cannot remain in the realm of pure logic or pure thinking. It also ontologically constitutes reality as such. So it has to externalize itself. So all of this, I think, will eventually leads us to a materialism, right? I'm just trying to draw the map here. So I'll say this again. Right. So we use concepts to explain things. To conceive is to think, and so on. The two things are identical. All right. Okay. But the last point here is that the concept is also ontologically constitutive of reality. It's not just simply a finite subjective mental activity. So when Hegel says of his own philosophy that it is, quote, the science of things captured in thoughts, it is a mistake to interpret this as him claiming that the world outside of the subject is somehow dependent on a subjective mind. So for Hegel, the external world, as it were, isn't mind dependent, nor is it mind independent. It is rather mind-like, mind-like, as in the mind and reality have the same logical structure, rational structure, right? But Hegel's not a dualist either. So when he says these two things are mind-like, he means they abide by the same single ontological process. So for Hegel, the concept, and this is another quote, as he says, the concept cannot be made up of determinations and relationships which are alien and external to things. Thinking things over directs us to the universal in things, but the universal is itself one of the moments of the concept. End quote. This is Hegel's point. So, thinking about external objects, that is, objects that are external to the subject, eventually leads us to discover that immanent to or internal to these objects themselves, according to Hegel, are conceptual determinations that have some sort of ontological reality within the objects. So as he said in the quote, for Hegel, thought, quote, directs us to universal concepts that are immanent to the particular object. And it is in this particular object from which concrete universality arises or emerges. It's only through encountering and thinking about, again, this is my cat example. It is only through encountering and thinking about my cat as a particular empirical animal that the concrete universal of all cats emerges. However, universality is just one of the three moments of the logic of the concept. So the concept for Hegel is, if you know, the three moments are universality, particularity, and individuality. So not only are there determinate concepts, that is, concepts about this or that thing, so for example, the concept of cat is a universal concept insofar as it includes within itself all species of cats. But so for Hegel, not only are concepts particular in this sense, but there's also the concept of the concept, which I mentioned before, which is the pure concept, and it is the concrete universal that includes within it any concept whatsoever within itself as its own particular. So for Hegel, conceptual determinations are just as much ontological as they are thought determinations. The external real world abides by the same rational structure that determines our thoughts. And this is in contrast to what for Hegel passes for subjective idealism. For example, Kant or Fichte or somebody, wherein the nature of the reality itself is not entirely dependent upon a knowing subject. So this is, so Hegel wants to get away from the subjective idealist conception. Okay, well, so what? Where has all of this gotten us up until this point? Well, Hegel's absolute idealism, I think, is not an anti-realist philosophy. He's not opposed to a realism. And I think this because Hegel does not deny the otherness of thought. He doesn't deny that. So Hegel is not saying everything is thinking, everything is encompassed within one mind. You can read him like that, but only crazy right Hegelian theologians read him like that because they think Hegel is discussing God all the time, and they're wrong, I think. That's a different debate. But so I don't think Hegel is saying everything is conceived within thought and there's no outside of thought, and therefore we're all solipsists or we're all Berkeleyans. He's not taking that position at all. He's not denying the reality of reality. He's not denying the reality of objects that are external to thought or external to the subject. He's not saying these things don't have any ontological status. On the contrary, he wants to account for the subject and the external world in a way that doesn't fall into some problems that he has with Kantianism. So for Hegel, the process of conceiving integrates this otherness of thought into itself. But this integration is a determination that is, like I just said, constitutive of reality as opposed to a determination which we as thinking subjects project onto reality, right? So I think this is the difference here, at least for me. Hegel isn't saying that we have this rational structure that we can think, and we're just, projecting it onto chairs and apples and cats and people and making a sense of the world that way. He's not doing that, because this is what, in a sense, this is sort of what Kant is doing for Hegel. So he is not a projectionist. He thinks this dialectical structure, as I call it, is already always imminent to reality as such for Hegel. There's always there. And human beings, thinking beings, use philosophy to reveal this reality. So while it is certainly true that as thinking subjects, we have concepts in the sense that we engage in thinking and we conceive of things, what we are ontologically, that is as beings, also corresponds with the dialectical structure of absolute negative universality, or what Hegel and the German idealists call the I. So the I is a self-referring and self-determining unity. And it is universal by way of its negative relation to its other. So on the one hand, the I has the structure of the pure concept itself as a self-referring thing. The I, as the pure concept, is only equal to itself, and so it determines itself rather than being dependent upon or determined by some other thing. On the other hand, the I, for Hegel, in its self-referring negativity, is, quote, singularity, absolute determinateness that stands opposed to anything other that excludes it. And Hegel calls it individual personality. So the I also makes up the individual subject for Hegel. So unlike Fichte's self-positing ego and Kant's transcendental I, Hegel's logic of the concept is not merely an act of thinking immanent to the finite subject. But as I've been saying this again and again, he thinks it is also constitutive of being as such. Both thought and reality have the same dialectically dynamic structure and genesis. Being and thought for Hegel are always already intertwined insofar as they enjoy the same immanent determinations for their content. For Hegel, the objectively real, as opposed to appearances of things in themselves, has its truth, or rather is true, if and only if it is ontologically identical with the concept. Conceptual determination is not only the underlying presupposition inherent in the activity of thinking, that is, when and what thought posits, but it is at the same time the ontologically generative and structural presupposition in reality of itself. The pure concept as the self-determining and self-referring I is in some sense subjective, and therefore cannot recognize itself same dialectical movement as an activity that constitutes objectivity. That is, the I isn't enough for Hegel. You need something more to really comprehend how there's this relation between objective reality and the logic of the concept, or the logic of the subject, whatever you want to call it. So the adequate concept that has its form in the objective as well as the subjective is, of course, what Hegel calls the absolute idea. It is within the idea that, quote, and this is what Hegel says, he says, the concept attains the realization absolutely adequate to it and is free in as much as in this real world, in its objectivity, it recognizes its subjectivity, and in this subjectivity, it recognizes the objective world, end quote. Hegel's point here is that it is in the absolute idea that there's this mutual self-relationality happening, where on the one hand, the subjective I, the finite I, the subject, is aware of itself as a subject, if you will, and can conceive and is aware of the same structure that structures the objective world. But these two things have to be mutual and reciprocal. They're not one way for Hegel. So the comprehension and recognition of the unity of being and thinking with respect to their conceptual determinations is what constitutes the absolute idea. For the idea not only avows and affirms the self-reflexivity of conceptualization inherent in thought, that is the subjective element, but also unifies this activity with reality that is outside thought itself, that is the objective. And of course, if you have read Hegel and if you know anything about Hegel, the absolute idea lets us, at the end of the book, at the end of the logic, the idea lets itself go into its other, and this is what Hegel calls nature. So at this point, the absolute idea has revealed itself to be the exposition of conceptual determinations as it figures in the entire movement of logical and ontological activity. Having the conceptual infinite form for its content, the idea not only traces the dialectical movement immanent to thought, but this infinite form, quote, emerges from the fabric of reality itself as it progresses or returns to the universal concept. So the idea, as something that we can think, integrates the subjective concept with the objectively real. So think of the idea as a bridge, if you want. The absolute idea is equally both substance on the one hand and subject on the other, because it mutually integrates or affirms the subjective concept into substance and substance into subject. The idea is the agreement of the concept and its object. So the absolute idea contains within itself all conceptual determinations and recognizes thought's activity of conceiving. The idea is absolute, that is non-relative, because it emerges in the science of logic as the supreme result of all conceptual determinations. There's nothing else left for the idea to think, because any and all thought determinations have come before it or precede it logically and conceptually. In this respect, the Hegelian absolute idea avoids, I think, falling into a performative contradiction, the kind I think we saw in Milieu, because it affirms this self-reflexive or self-awareness dynamic. The absolute idea, I think, acknowledges the conceptual determinations inherent in the activity of thought as well as being. However, as we have seen, Hegel's I does not simply refer to a finite thinking subject. It expresses the unity of a process that has its own necessity over and above the particular individual circumstances of empirical subjects. Hegel's absolute idea as a transformative dialectical activity constitutes a praxis that is as much material as it is ideal, because it openly recognizes its inherent conceptual presuppositions. And so we're now finally getting to Marx. And so I think it is in this active dynamic process which Marx appears, or where Marx becomes relevant, I think. Because Marx inherited the dialectical method from Hegel, of course, as we all know. And it is Hegel's absolute idea that informs Marx's dialectical materialism. It is a materialism with an idea, or with the idea, which would be more accurate to say. And it is this kind of materialism which I think sets Marx and dialectical materialism more generally apart from other non-idealist or non-dialectical forms of materialist philosophy. Because I think both Hegel and Marx appreciate the role of the subject, or the role of the role of the absolute idea of the concept, let's say. So I'm going to just briefly talk about Marx, and I'm going to wrap it up there, and then we can have some questions. So Marx's brand of materialism is, of course, dialectical, because as I just said, it integrates this dynamic activity of Hegel's absolute idea within itself. And remember, the absolute idea is understood as the unity or the agreement of the concept with reality. So rather than posit that the foundational basis of all reality is quote unquote matter, which older Greek atomists did, for example, they said everything is matter, everything is atomism or atoms. That is, rather than make the ground of all materialism a universal idealization, which Hegel was critical of, Marx does something different, of course. Marx strives to shift the emphasis from merely contemplating materialism to practicing it as a human activity. So as we all know, I hope Marx emphasizes the role of praxis. He's not content with all previous forms of materialism, because he thinks they suffer from the same problem. Namely, for Marx, they all conceive of the material, external reality as abstractions, as objects of mental thinking. Marx stresses the importance of a materialism predicated on human activity rather than on reflective thought. So, in true Hegelian fashion, Marx emphasizes that the objective truth of reality itself is not something that we can prove in thought or in thinking, but is something that can only be proven practically by and through human activity. If you know Engels' joke, he said that the proof of the pudding is in eating, right? You prove the existence of the food, of the pudding, by eating it rather than apply concepts to it. This is sort of the point here. So Hegel's absolute idea, as we have seen, of course, transforms and transcends the theoretical practical divide by integrating them both into a single and same conceptual active process. Dialectical materialism, as a materialism with the idea, is one that acknowledges this transcendence. So as Marx says in Thesis 8 of his Thesis on Feuerbach, this is just a quick quote, he says, "Social life is essentially practical. All mysteries which mislead theory into mysticism find their rational solution in human practice and in the comprehension of this practice. So this is important, I think, even though it's a very short sentence. Marx is saying two things at once, or is making 2 points here that is important. So to avoid mysticism, he thinks materialist theory ought to emphasize or ought to find its rational solution in human practice and in the comprehension of this practice. Marx does not merely claim here that the rational solution to social life lies in human praxis alone, but rather that it relies on both practice and the comprehension of this practice. In other words, you have to have theory, or to put it another way, you have to have thinking as well as activity, or thinking as well as praxis. So the comprehension of human practice, of theory and practice in one, is, of course, I think what we can call as, or what Hegel calls as, the absolute idea. Because, of course, it is the unity of conceptual determination or comprehension on the one hand, and of objectivity, or in Marx's language, human practice on the other. Here, Marx is emphasizing the unity of the two. He's reiterating Hegel's point that the unity of subject and substance, or in Marx's language, human practice and comprehension of the practice, is what is needed. Or, to put it in the language of correlationism, the unity of thinking and being. Here we find the same dialectical unity of theory and practice. And Marx reiterates this in further down in the Thesis when he says, sorry, this is from the 1844 manuscripts. So in another text, Marx kind of reemphasizes the need to have both theory and practice when he says the head of this emancipation is philosophy, its heart is a proletariat. Philosophy cannot be made a reality without the sublation of the proletariat. The proletariat cannot be abolished without philosophy being made a reality, end quote. So here again, we see Marx very clearly adopting Hegelian language and emphasizing the need and the necessity of both praxis, that is the proletarian revolution, political activity, on the one hand, and on the other hand, philosophy as he says, as the head of the emancipation. So philosophy cannot be realized without the proletariat, as he says. So, and I've just 2 points, and then I'll be concluding. So, unlike Melissa's speculative materialism, and I would just add here all other non-dialectical or materialisms that are in denial of their idealism, which all seek to go beyond the subject, or they want to decenter the subject only to fall into performative contradictions. Dialectical materialism, as a materialism with the idea, avoids this because it not only openly proclaims its foundational idealist roots, but also goes beyond the finite subject by integrating subjectivity and the substance into its doctrine. The absolute idea, as the equality of substance and subject, constitutes being and thinking into a single totality. And so finally, just to conclude, in the final analysis, dialectical materialism, as a materialism with the idea, and by idea here I mean the absolute idea, encompasses the subject-substance doctrine within itself. The Hegelian absolute idea and the idea's subjective aspect allows dialectical materialism to recognize the conceptual determinations inherent in its dynamic activity. The idea's substantial aspect allows it to recognize the conceptual determination, allows it to recognize the conceptual determinations internal to reality itself. So the Hegelian lesson in all of this, I think, the Hegelian subject lesson turns out to be that the subject is not just subject, but also equally and always already substance. Thank you very much. I hope that made some sense.
Mm. Do you want to go over the chat? There are some questions.
Sure. Yes. Okay. Let me see here. Yes, there's some. Yes. So someone asked me to explain the difference between negative universality and positive universality. Negative. Well, okay. Well, it's yes. Well, that has to do with. I mean, I briefly went over it, but that has to do with the particular universal relationship. So the kind of common way that we all think about a universal concept is we think of it as a genus, right? We think of it as an abstract category that is supposed to encompass all that's supposed to encompass all other particular versions of itself within itself, right? But Hegel has a name for this. So you can think about this as a positive universal, if you like. Hegel calls it an abstract universal because the way it works is that this universal abstracts all content from particular examples, right? So if I wanted to think about the universal concept of books, I would first go and try to find a lot of particular books and then pile them together, as it were, conceptually in my head, and abstract from that particular assortment of books a universal concept that tries to account for all of it, if you see what I mean. So for Hegel, the positive or the abstract universal is abstract because it's an abstraction. It abstracts its content from particular versions of itself. Now, the problem with this for Hegel is that you always end up excluding things. And it's not really a universal because it's a formal universality. It's an abstraction. In some sense, it's sort of indifferent to its content. So, I mean, last week, I think I used the Black Lives Matter, All Lives Matter example, and I think that applies here. So the statement "all lives matter" is a abstract universal because its version of universality is supposedly a proper universal. It's supposed to be inclusive of everything. But for Hegel, that sort of universality is always already exclusionary because you can't include everything in this abstract way. You can't say all lives matter and this is going to account for everyone's lives equally all the time, because as we all know, racism in America, a lot of African Americans have been saying, well, wait a minute, our lives aren't mattering at the moment, so we don't see our lives mattering equally as white Americans. The statement all lives matter is indifferent to that particular content. It isn't able to affirm the particular lived reality, let's say, of the slogan Black Lives Matter, right? So I hope this makes sense. So the abstract universal statement, all lives matter, not only is it politically problematic and ridiculous and it falls short and it has all these problems with it, but as a concept, it's not a good universal concept. It's an abstract, empty thing. When you say all lives matter, you're not saying anything for Hegel. I mean, of course, yes, of course, all lives matter, but why? I mean, this universality. So the way this universality works is it abstracts from its particular content, but this act of abstraction ends up excluding and damaging and in some sense ignoring the difference that exists within particular versions of itself, right? So if all lives actually did matter, there wouldn't be a need for the Black Lives Matter movement. And Hegel's point is you can't really account for the particular concept or the particular situation that Black Lives Matter is drawing attention to in this statement of all lives matter, if you see what I mean. Because the statement remains very abstract and vague, and it doesn't account for the particular lived experience of Black Americans. I hope this example is helping. So that's the abstract universal, right? On the one hand, what he calls the concrete universal, or the negative universal, if you like, functions in a different way. The concrete universal, as I try to explain with my cat example, for Hegel, you don't arrive at this universality by abstracting from particular contents, right? You don't do that. The concrete universal for Hegel emerges through the particular, right? So it's not an act of abstraction where you can abstract from something concrete like Black Lives Matter into something abstract like all lives matter. Rather, for Hegel, the concrete universal is concrete because it is something that is negatively affirmed in a particular statement. So, for example, when someone says Black Lives Matter, that statement does two things at once for Hegel. Firstly, it, of course, points to the very real problem of racism and institutional racism in America that has been historically engendered within capitalism in America and so on. So on the one hand, the slogan Black Lives Matter does what the slogan says it does. It emphasizes the need to focus on Black lives at the moment, right? Secondly, it also shows why the statement all lives matter is false, because it shows that the statement all lives matter is exclusionary, right? But by showing that the abstract universal statement all lives matter is empty and false and problematic, Black Lives Matter as a slogan for Hegel is more universal than the sentence all lives matter, right? Because when you affirm Black Lives Mattering, you affirm a sense of all life mattering in a universal sense, but that universality isn't a positive asserted statement. It's not affirmed in a positive sense. It arises negatively, if you want to think about it this way. That is, it arises through a particular, right? Through the claim Black Lives Matter. Or if you want another quick, easy example, then I'll stop talking about this. So the point for Hegel is when we use language to express a particular, we're also at the same time expressing a universal. The two go hand in hand. And his favorite example of this is whenever human beings say I, they are referring to themselves as a particular human being, but the I is also a universal concept. So they're also referring to all other individual I's, right? But you see how when I'm referring to myself as an I, that's the positive aspect of it. I'm not referring to everyone else, right? I'm just referring to me. But Hegel's point is the universal claim of all I's is included within the reference to me, but in a negative sense, if that makes sense. So I'll stop there because I could go on and on about this stuff.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Borna.
Okay, I hope that makes sense. I think we have some more questions on the chat. Okay, so David is asking, they're asking, so I'll just read the question. I would like to know how do you understand that relation between substance and subject in contrast with the Žižekian notion of it as non-relation or negative determination? Well, this is a pretty big topic. I think Žižek is doing interesting things with it. I basically think that, okay, if for Žižek, if it's a non-relation, then there's some sort of relation there, right? So Žižek says it's a negative determination. But all this means is that there is a relation there, but it's not a positive relation, or it's not a relation that is affirmed, right? So similar to the question I just answered, the relation between substance and subject is one that they relate to each other as negative determinations of one another, but they're also identical, right? Because they're kind of both part of the whole for Hegel, and I think Žižek, or I would hope he would agree with that. Okay, we have another question here. Okay, so Lily is saying that, I'll just read out her criticism and question. So she says, I'm not sure I agree with her criticism of Melissa's position. The very notion of speculative is a sign of reflexivity. What Melissa argues against is the dependence on thought of the real for its existence. Also, I would agree that Hegel thinks himself a realist, but doesn't the very idea or ideal that the real is rational and the rational is real produce a nature that is measurable, knowable, conceptuable, made on the image of rationality, exactly what quantum physics tells us it's not. Okay, so the criticism of Melissa, yes, so that's true. Melissa does call his position a speculative position. But I'm not sure that accounts for the reflexivity that I was talking about. I mean, maybe it does account for some form of reflexivity. And that's something that maybe we could talk about in more detail, but at least the sort of self-reflexivity that I was highlighting in the talk, I mean, it's clear, I think, that Melissa doesn't acknowledge that. So you see that Melissa argues against. So what he argues against for you is the dependence on thought of the real to its existence, right? This is correlationism. Right. Well, I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know, but I mean, the way that I understand Melissa's argument is that he wants to get away from correlationism, right? His whole complaint is that ever since Kant, continental philosophy, for the most part, has been caught within Kant's shadow. You know, we haven't gotten out of the correlationist circle for Melissa, and he wants to get out of that correlationist circle. And the correlation is between thought and being, or between thought and, I guess, what you call here the real or existence. As the Hegel part, well, okay. One thing to say is that so the translation that uses the term "real" in the sentence "real is rational, rational is real" is outdated and misleading. When Hegel says, so the more updated translations of it are actuality. So what is actual is rational, and what is rational is actual. And the difference is that for Hegel, actuality does not mean is not a stable thing. So actuality is Wirklichkeit. My German is terrible, and Hegel distinguishes that from existence, from Dasein, from determinate existence. He also makes a distinction between reality and actuality. So when he says the actual is rational and the rational is actual, what he means by this is that actuality for Hegel is a process. It's a process of becoming. It's not a fixed, stable thing. So what he's really saying there is that both rationality and actuality, again, have this kind of mutual relation between them. And what this means is that actuality, and in actuality, if you want to think about that as the external world as objects, as I mean, what Hegel calls actual is what he calls world history, what he calls objective spirit, what he calls politics, society, so on. And all of this is caught in a process of spirit, or what he calls absolute spirit, coming to know itself and produce itself. And so it's a more generative dynamic activity. So just make that clarification. So, right, and so that's the first thing. The second thing, so you're wondering if this produces a nature that is measurable or knowable, made on the image of rationality. Well, it's not made on the image of rationality. As I tried to, I hope it was clear, as I tried to argue, for Hegel, the rational, the subjective activity of thinking or thought is the same as the rational structure of reality itself. So all of reality is rational for Hegel, in the sense that it follows a specific logic, if you will, that he thinks philosophy can make intelligible, and we can kind of comprehend and understand and know this reality. And as to quantum physics, I'm not well versed within quantum physics to tell you whether or not quantum physics invalidates Hegel's idealism. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. But I mean, I know that Žižek, for example, has worked on quantum physics and Hegel, so he might have a better answer. Sorry. Any other questions or comments or criticisms?
Hi, can I try and somehow follow up on that out loud rather than write it down? Because I don't know if I could write it down, because I don't know if it's coherent, but I was interested in your kind of critique of Meillassoux as well. And in the way I understand Meillassoux is that, yes, he does want to break the limits of the Kantian kind of correlation between concept and appearance. And I think one of the reasons he wants to do that is, as he says in, as I'm sure you know, in Time Without Becoming, has said very often, he wants to reason the all, And so in kind of breaking this correlational dynamic between concept and appearance, one can achieve adequacy between concept and the object. And that takes place, in my opinion, for Meillassoux, it takes place in the space of the mental. So this brings up, more than anything for me, a problem of representation, if you like. And I was really interested in how you added as well about how when we break the border between the noumenon phenomenon in Kant, what reconstituted are different kinds of borders in knowing and in reason, and they kind of hinge upon this relationship between concept and perception as well. And so what I was wondering about is, say, how we generate the concept of objectivity from the space of the conventional, the given, and also how that concept of objectivity lands back in the world of appearances. So, for example, in the essay, I think the introduction essay, there was this kind of very cliched example of the Holbein, right, where one experiences not a representation, let's say, of thinking beyond the world of appearances, but it's a process of perception that reminds us of our finitude in the world, and therefore we can think the objective. I think that's how it's kind of put in some kind of form. And this is quite a cliche trope of, to go through a process of perception, understand your finitude, and therefore access the concept of the infinite. And yet the concept of the object has a representational form as well, in the very idea of the in the kind of idea of the methodology, or the process in itself becomes a site of a convention. So I'm kind of, in the Mea Su and in the text that you've given us, I think there's this kind of recurrent problem of how do we deal with representations, how do we deal with images, appearance, and the claim that of a kind of site of non-representation when we often think about the process of knowing. So this idea of how it lands back in the world of the empirical and the sense-based, I think is quite interesting. And I don't know if I've made sense there myself, but I just think there's a kind of persistent problem, both in the Mea Su and in these papers, about how we might consider the world of appearances when we often say that the world of appearances is inadequate to comprehending having a comprehension of the objective. And I can go on more, but I'll stop now.
Yes, thank you. Yes, this is it's a important question. I mean, I would just say that insofar as we're talking about appearances or representation, well, first of all, I'm not sure that they're identical. I mean, it sort of depends what you mean by appearance. If you mean the kind of phenomena of objects, like, so if you mean it in the Kantian sense that they're just kind of phenomena that we have in our empirical experience of things, because so that's one sense that we can think about appearance. But of course, appearances, the word appearance presupposes that there's something that is appearing. In other words, it presupposes a thing in itself, an essence, or Kant's noumena, something that is appearing to us. And if you're Kant, or if you're happy with Kant's answer, we can never, of course, know the thing in itself. We can only really know in a sense that we can have knowledge of experiences. We can know, we can know appearances in our experiences, right? So we can never experience the thing in itself, and we can never know it for Kant, but we can think it. And I mean, I have a soft spot for Kant because, God bless him, he took 10 years to write the Critique of Pure Reason. But it created more problems than it solved lots of problems when Milieu says he wants to get back to the pre-critical philosophies of the great outdoors. You have to wonder if he really means what he says, because what he seems to be implying is that he wants to get back to Spinoza and Locke and Hume and what he says, pre-critical thinkers, right? But curiously, he doesn't spend too much time mentioning Spinoza, because Spinoza would give him a hard time, I think. But so the first thing I would say, at least this is what Hegel, so Hegel's criticism of Kant, of course, is that, he has many criticisms, but one of his criticisms is that the thing in itself is a stupid concept, right? Kant has this noumena that he inserts in the book. He makes this distinction between phenomena and noumena, between finite and infinite, but he doesn't see how they're related, right? So Kant says, yes, the thing in itself is that which does not appear to us, so we can't really know it, we can't have knowledge of it, we can't access it, right? But Hegel's point is that, well, if it's really something that is not, Hegel's kind of question to Kant is, well, what the hell is it then? If it's not something we can know or access, but we can think, how can we think it without knowing it? What are we thinking when we're thinking the noumena? And Hegel thinks it's a very stupid, ill-conceived concept, because if you really take Kant literally, what he's saying is things in themselves are things that have no relation to anything else. Because if they were to have relations to anything else, they would appear in some sense. I mean, Kant doesn't even say that I mean, they're not even beings, because we don't know anything about them. We can ascribe, for Kant, we can't ascribe any categories to the thing itself, right? But Hegel's criticism is, well, if it's nothing then. It's just this concept that is doing nothing for you and is generating problems. So Hegel's criticism, and this is from the Force and Understanding chapter of the Phenomenology, but he reiterates this criticism in the Science of Logic, in his in the Doctrine of Essence, where he's talking about appearances and essences. So Hegel says, well, wait a minute. The thing to really understand about appearances is that there's nothing behind the appearance. The appearance is the thing. That's it. Right? So basically, to start to try to answer your concerns, I would maybe point out that Hegel has some sort of criticism of Kant here, and he thinks he has a solution to Kant. And his solution is that when the subject realizes that what it's doing is positing something behind the appearances and trying to understand that thing, it's falling into all these contradictions. And once the subject realizes that this attempt to get at the thing itself is futile and stupid and ridiculous, that it's the subject itself that is positing a supersensible realm, a realm that is beyond the senses, then this is when the subject for Hegel attains self-consciousness, right? Because the subject becomes aware of its own self-reflexive positing, if you see what I mean. Basically, what he means by this is the way to get around the thing itself is to realize it's a concept that does nothing for thought and it does nothing for philosophy. It just creates a lot of problems which can't be resolved. So why not just get rid of it? Right? But what this means for Hegel is that, yes, we have tables and chairs and people. Great. They are things we experience that we can have knowledge of, but there aren't things in themselves, because what does that mean? Right? It's like asking, so if you were to ask Hegel, if a tree falls in a forest and if there's no one around to hear it, does it make a sound? Hegel would say, why would you ever ask that question? It is stupid and ridiculous. Why? Because we know trees make sounds when they fall. We have had that experience. We have instruments that record it. Physics tells us as much. So we have knowledge of that event already. So when you formulate a question that subtracts the subject from the equation, as it were, and repackages the problem, Hegel says, what are you doing? Right? Because you yourself as a human being are a subject. So trying to delete yourself from the equation and reformulating the problem as, a thing in itself problem is for Hegel asinine in a certain respect. In the same way that I think Milius's attempt to get outside of the subject in a sense is kind of asinine, because he's contradicting himself. He is a subject himself. He's doing philosophy himself. He's using concepts when he says we want to get at the great outdoors, right? He doesn't have a metaphysics, right? Of course he does. So that's appearances. The point is that there's nothing behind the appearance. For representation, because the old Miller translation in English translates the German word Vorstellung, which now is translated as representation. Miller translates this in the phenomenology as picture thinking or picture thoughts, which is meant to capture Hegel's disdain for this sort of thinking. Famously, Hegel said that religion is very close to philosophy because they have the same content, namely the absolute. But the difference is for Hegel that religion and religious thinking is stuck in the realm of representation. Because what it does for Hegel is it takes something that is present in being and repackages it, represents it, reformulates it in imagery. So the stories of the Bible and Christian theology and all of that are for Hegel, they're essentially human civilization's attempt to think the absolute by representational means. So the form of the absolute that you get in religion is better than art for Hegel, but it's not as great as philosophy because it has a distinction between its form and the content. So, so one thing to mention is that because your question, I believe, was about representation and about whether or not representation might be a problem, and it could be. But I think I would also maybe wonder: do we need to have a conception of the absolute or the absolute idea, whatever you want to call it, to get beyond representation? Because remember, we do represent and conceive of things as objects to ourselves that are finite all the time, right? But something that is infinite is harder to conceptualize, and Hegel was aware of this. So was Schelling. A lot of all the German idealists after Kant realized that the issue here is that if philosophy's goal is to think something like the absolute, the very real problem is that as human beings, as consciousnesses, as subjects, that which is absolute can't be represented to us in experience, right? We can't have an experience of the absolute in the sense that we can have an experience of a cat or a book or something. Because to do so for Hegel would be to turn the absolute into a finite thing. It would be to oppose yourself to the absolute. It would be to say the absolute is over there on one side, I'm over here, and I'm now interpreting or having an experience of the absolute. Basically, you turn the absolute into something that is not absolute, right? So,
yeah, so that's my point, that the kind of description of process, the process of coming to be self-reflexive, is posited as process, as in a process of I see it, I perceive an image like this, and I perceive it like this, and it conjures or generates this conception of self-reflexivity, which allows me to negate, to kind of have this tension between my understanding of my finitude and the infinite. So what I'm saying is that very process activates a similar kind of condition to the kind of dominance of representational politics that it tries to disavow. It doesn't escape the problem of representation, despite the fact that it says it's non-representational, because it's a construction of a process that gets repeated as a convention in the history of politics and art for centuries.
How do you, can I maybe ask you to elaborate that last point? Why do you think that it's not why do you think that it is a representational process? I'm not sure I follow.
Well, it's representational in the sense that it produces all of the same political problems that you just identified around representation. And it's representational in the sense that it philosophically produces those problems, in the sense that if I can reproduce my Holbein painting, right, I can construct that, I can engineer very easily the process of thinking the object. And art has done this for ever, right? It does it all the time. It's quite a cliche in the art world to produce this experience, and it's really easy. So it's what it tells me is that these notions of understanding through non-representational processes have all the problems that are packaged in representational thinking are not eliminated just because we start to think about process. So yeah, that's hopefully more clear.
Right. But I wonder, so sorry, just I'll ask you another question. Okay, but I'm wondering if, so are you saying that you think this also applies to what I said in the presentation? Or is it something that maybe only applies to milieu? Because I'm not.
Oh, I think it's in all, as I was saying, I think that problem is in all the papers that we were given. So I think that there is a problem of thinking like the naturalization of representation in, you know, like people are obviously very interested in thinking the non-representational rather than the naturalization of representation.
Right.
And I would argue to think the problem of the naturalization of representation, as opposed to trying to eliminate representation or think that we can get outside of it. So I think that there's a kind of problem there to be thought through.
Sure. I mean, I guess, I mean, maybe I'm still not really getting your criticism. So I apologize, but I'm trying to follow what you're saying. I mean, I don't think anything I said was necessarily representational, in the sense that, again, it depends how you define that term and how you're using it. Because I mean, from a Hegelian point of view, or at least for Hegel, the point I tried to emphasize in the presentation was that concepts and conceptual thinking and so on, you can't get out of it, right? This is kind of my overarching point, is that concepts are, when we think, we use concepts, we think through an in concept and so on. But I'm not sure how that is representational, right? I mean, so I did use representational examples. I talked about cats and books and other objects, sure, as examples. But Hegel is very, but I mean, the point here, at least from a Hegelian point of view, is that all of this is just, well, we can think conceptually and representationally, and we can think in different other forms as well. But the difference is that within representational forms of thinking are concepts, right? Because the point is, you can't get out of concepts. When we think, we use concepts, right? But the reverse isn't true for Hegel. So conceptual thinking, which for him would be pure thought, which is the topic of his Science of Logic, right? That isn't representational for Hegel, because and by that he means we're not, you know, it's not a picture thought. It's not a imaginary musing of a finite mind or something. It's not referring to any object. So all the categories in the logic for Hegel are they're abstract, in the sense that they're not referring to any representational examples or objects, but they're not empty, right? It's not an empty formalism, because he tries to show that, as you probably maybe well know, that that logical thinking can create its own content and so on and so forth. So so if you, and this is my question to you, I don't know, but if you're on board with all of that, if you think, okay, maybe Hegel is making some interesting points here, I'm not sure, I guess I'm still missing how representation comes back in. But you mentioned it in my paper, or you thought that it was present in what I said today. And maybe it is, I don't know. Maybe because I did speak about Marx, as you know, my point was to emphasize a materialism that tries to encompass its idealism, or you know, tries to encompass and take account of the subject. So if you think, for example, that the use of the term subject and what I said, you know, the word subject, if you think that is a representation, then I think Hegel would have something to say, because he would say, well, not necessarily. We human beings are subjects, that's true, but the subject isn't simply reducible for Hegel to the human being. nor is it has a purely logical or conceptual dimension. Let me put it this way. And what that dimension is something that people have been debating for years and years, because of course Hegel is critical of Kant, so he doesn't want to have a notion of the transcendental subject, right? I mean, if you're Kant, yes, Kant says, yes, the transcendental subject is always with us and so on, but it's different from our empirical representational self, right? So Kant makes this distinction. And Hegel kind of says, yes, okay, there's that distinction, but what he calls the subject, what Hegel calls the subject, is not transcendental. But I'm going to stop there because I can go on and on about this. I hope that made some sense. Maybe it didn't. There's some more chat. Okay, so we have some more chat. No more chat. Any okay, so any other questions or comments? Any old school Marxists want to yell at me for including Hegel and Marx's materialism?
So I hasn't talked about myself, then I old school Marxist, but Marxist ideas near to me. I write in to chat two questions. First, what is the difference in short words between dialectical, aleatory, in Althusser thought, and speculative materialism? So second question is, what do you think about Spinozist interpretation of Hegel's system and Marxism? So I suggest is very productive. I suggest that idea of unity of substance is materialist and true as a field of transformations of the modes of this substance, not as a metaphysical Platonic one, as some authors it interpret. What do you think about to these questions, please?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I can see your questions in the chat. So the first one, what is the difference between dialectical, aleatory, and speculative materialism? Well, if by speculative materialism you mean, for example, Milius's materialism or Milius's position, I tried to explain the differences here a little bit. You know, dialectical materialism, I think, you know, doesn't try to shy away from or dismiss the role of the subject in its materialism. I think it affirms it in a very strong way. And to do so would be important, I think, and not to affirm the subject, which is what Milius, for example, you know, he's not keen on doing, or he wants to get away from the correlation of thought and being. I think falls into a lot of problems. Now, aleatory materialism, and I'm gonna guess you mean Althusser materialism. I'm gonna have to get back to you on that. I have read Althusser years and years and years ago, but not recently. And my head is full of Hegel these days because I'm writing my dissertation. So unfortunately, I can't give you a satisfactory answer about aleatory materialism, but it's a very important question. And it's something I will have to think about in the future. So thank you for that. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend to talk about Althusser when I haven't read him seriously in some years. At least what he says about aleatory materialism I haven't read recently. Okay, your second question about Spinoza. So Spinoza's interpretation of Hegel's system. Well, I do like Spinoza. I'm not critical of the more Spinoza's interpretations of Hegel. Maybe you know my good friend Harrison Fless, who is a Spinozist, Hegelian Marxist in some sense. he and we have some differences. He's angry at me because I'm not a Spinozist, really. And I think that's okay. No, but okay, more seriously. Hegel, of course, admired Spinoza, as maybe you all know. Spinoza is very important for Hegel. I think this way of reading Hegel is interesting, and I think it's very productive. I'm not against it. I just have a few questions and differences with this, with this reading, because I think, yes, it's important to understand Spinoza's relationship to Hegel, or Hegel's reading of Spinoza and so on. But Hegel was also very critical of Spinoza in many ways, and these aren't just political criticisms; they're philosophical, metaphysical criticisms that Hegel took very seriously. So, in that aspect, I would have some issues with it, I think. But other than that, I have no real problems with Spinoza or Spinoza's reading of Hegel. And to your suggestion, so you suggested that the idea of unity of substance is materialist. Yes, I agree. But I would say, and which was the point of my talk, right? I would say, yes, it's a materialist unity, but the materialism has the idea inside it. You know what I mean? you can't get rid of the idea or the the concept in that way. Yes, I hope that answered your last question.
Thank you for answers. Next questions, other list.
Yes. Any other comments or questions? Yes, thank you. Lily had a good point about aleatory materialism.
Hi, sorry, can I just say, I don't actually know, it's not really, hey, it's not really so much a question. I think it's kind of awkward, kind of like throwing things in the chat, but I guess what I was kind of trying to say earlier is that for me, at least the way that I understand Milas's argument is not so much about getting outside thought. And that's what I meant by saying that, the use of the word speculative is itself an acknowledgement of the fact that, it's all about thought, but it's rather an attempt to think with the real against a kind of thinking that basically thinks the real in terms of the subject. So even though I understand what you're saying, I still think that it's kind of, it's not exactly the way that I understand Milas's argument, for example. And, perhaps I'm also not right, but there's a moment, and this is kind of like a different thing, but it's also related, in Kant, for example, right, where for me the Kantian sublime is proof that Kant is himself a realist, and that that is the moment where he loses the great outdoors, where he says thought cannot get there. So my issue with kind of like Hegelian dialectical thought is that it thinks it can get everywhere, and that's what I think for me is kind of the issue with the subject, that the subject thinks that it can control, and that there is no territory where the subject can go. So perhaps, I guess what I'm saying is that and aleatory materialism for me is a good example of this, that perhaps the great outdoors is precisely the place that exists, but where the subject can go as subject, that it has to give up, and on rationality. So I guess my question before was more about, where is nonsense, where is poetry, where is non-conceptual thinking in Hegel? And do you think that all thought is necessarily conceptual?
Thanks. Right. Okay. With Melissa, I mean, it's I mean, look, yes, maybe my reading of Milius isn't the most charitable. Let me put it this way. But it's and yes, it's true. He's still, of course, he's doing a speculative project. I think you're right in pointing that out. And he says that he's doing a speculative project. So you know, it's not like he's trying to hide that part of it. But I think, but I mean, for me, the and this is why I focused on correlation in Milius specifically, right? Because he is very clear, I think, in saying he wants to oppose this correlationism. He wants to have, I mean, you know, he basically wants philosophy to be able to, okay, account for thought, but and also do ontology, but you know, as he says, in a way that isn't well, that isn't correlationist, that isn't kind of stuck in this entanglement or whatever you want to call it, where whenever philosophy tries to think of the great outdoors, it's or you know, whenever it tries to think of being, you know, the thought of the subject or thought itself is stitched onto ontology, if you see what I mean. He wants to break that, right? So my question to him is, okay, but how are you going about trying to break this correlation? If, I mean, never mind if what he calls correlation is even accurate, right? That's a different conversation. But okay, let's say what he says is accurate of Kant and post-Kantian philosophy, okay. But at least in his book, he doesn't, at least I think so. I'm personally not entirely persuaded by his attempt. You know, like he says, he does want to get at the great outdoors of the pre-critical thinkers. But I mean, even if you ask Kant, okay, Hegel more so, but even if you ask Kant, Kant would say, where have I said we don't have the great outdoors, right? I mean, people forget that, you know, you go through the entire Critique of Pure Reason, you know, the A edition and the B edition, you read Kant's book, and at the end of it, what you're left with is people, tables and chairs, books, the outside world. It doesn't go away, right? All Kant says, and this is why everyone is upset with him, right, is he says, we can only have knowledge of the phenomena, right, that is in our experience, that things that appear to us, because we use the transcendental categories in conjunction with sense data from my Kantian terms are dying, from whatever you want to call it, from the world, to have an experience, right? For Kant, you need both, right? What is it? What's that famous line? Concepts without intuition are empty. Intuition without concepts is blind, right? Okay, fine, great, Kant, thank you. But his point is, we get the world. You know, we have tables and chairs and people and so on. So my question to Milius is, what great outdoors is he talking about, right? Because, okay, you said the outdoors where the subject cannot go or something like this. And I'm wondering, well, my question to you would be, or Milius, well, what does this mean, right? As in, how, because again, does this get away from the performative contradiction, right? Because what's going on here is we have Milius, who's a philosopher, who's a human subject, who thinks, who uses concepts like being, correlation, subject, outdoors, inside, whatever. He's using all of these concepts to think about the great outdoors where the subject, he wants to think of the great outdoors in a way that isn't dependent upon a subjectivist position, right? And that's fine, because you can have non-subjectivist philosophy, you know, the German idealists, Schelling, Hegel, and so on, Marx, Heidegger, you name them, they're not subjectivist. But he thinks they're not enough. He doesn't like those philosophers either, because he thinks they're still stuck in correlationism. So my question to him is, what outdoors is he talking about? And if it's we as philosophers who get to the outdoors, we are subjects. So the subject is there anyway, right? So if we use philosophy to think the outdoors without subjects, you're bringing the subject with you because you are a subject. You cannot escape being a subject, right? So this is my big issue here, is that can he do this without contradicting himself? And by contradicting himself, I mean, can he do this without falling into performative contradiction, which is he aware that he is a subject human being doing philosophy? You know what I mean? So I don't know if this answered that point, but sorry, I'm just going to answer the other parts of your question, and then maybe we can discuss a bit. You also asked about Hegel, or sorry, you asked about poetry and nonsense, like nonsense poetry, and whether Hegel thinks we can think without, or whether there are forms of thinking that aren't conceptual. For Hegel, I mean, for Hegel himself, he would say no, because, I mean, yes, there are nonsense. There are ways of expressing oneself that isn't conceptual. Sure, there's art, there is different forms of expression, but for Hegel, I mean, even for him, art has a history, and art can be conceptually understood, right? So Hegel is only really interested in art insofar as because he thinks the history of European art, for the most part, is the history of humanity trying to understand the absolute for Hegel, right? So Hegel has this historical view of what he thinks is world history. And it's just humanity trying to explain the absolute to itself over thousands of years. The Egyptians tried to do it through art, through pyramids, and so on and so on and so on. Religions tried to do it, and it's philosophy's job to actually do it. I mean, I think Hegel would say to you, and I'm saying Hegel, not me, but I think Hegel would say, well, all right, fine. Show me a form of thinking that doesn't involve concepts, right? Now it's like even Deleuze, who, I mean, his form of thinking is not rational in the Hegelian sense. I mean, even Deleuze admits he's using concepts, or thinking is conceptual. There's a conceptual process going on, right? I'm not saying Deleuze would agree with Hegel here. He probably won't or doesn't. But my point is that my question to you would be, one, okay, what do you mean by thinking in this respect? Do you have any examples of thinking that isn't conceptual? Because that would interest me. That would be cool, because I don't know. I mean, even when you're like daydreaming and thinking about, oh, I need to go and buy milk tomorrow, Hegel would say, yes, you're using concepts. Milk, tomorrow, these are all.
I guess the kind of thing that I'm talking about, though, is so poetry for me is not conceptual necessarily. It involves movement, and movement has to do with the body, and that kind of thing for me is truly material. And when you think about sort of like geometry is abstract, but depends on an understanding of movement that is experienced first by the body. Without it, you wouldn't really have the ability to produce. So the concept. So for me, the concept is what comes after, and that's why I wonder. And I'm not, the question of materialist too, for me, I don't actually defend his position necessarily, but I do think that it is important to ask. It's kind of like, Heidegger returning to the question of being, for me, performs a similar movement. It's not really about the answer, it's about the question itself. But I do think that there are, and that's why I brought up quantum physics, for example, because for me, there's a lot of writing in there that actually talks about Hegel kind of describing the rational as real, or like the real as rational, and how what happens there is actually the opposite. There is no way to conceptualize, and we know that every concept is only sort of contingent or temporary in this sense. So that is the place where the subject, the conceptual or rational subject, can't go. It can only, have this like in between sort of like state of knowledge that is really not secure at all. So even though I'm fully with you on the subject of Hegel, I just wonder how, I think that there's so many sort of like moments or things that you kind of have to defend Hegel against today, that I just kind of, you know, yeah, I'm curious that it's what you would choose to kind of like hold on to this thought.
You mean me specifically? Or like who do you mean would hold on to this? Me or Hegel or in the,
no,
like,
I guess
the last
what
stage
I'm
then?
saying is, like, you know, is Hegelian thought today really sort of, you know, what is the most useful thing about it? Because I don't think that its usefulness has to do with getting to kind of like the real, or I'm just not, I think I'm not entirely convinced that the Hegelian materialism is the best kind of materialism out there, I guess, even though, you know, I appreciate the fact that you're arguing for it, but I'm
Sure.
still not convinced by it.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, look, for myself, you know, I mean, Hegel isn't the end all and be all. There are many important thinkers that came after Hegel, of course, that we all need to read and contend with, and so on. I mean, I suppose, so one thing to say is that, yes, there's a limit to, at the end of the day, Hegel himself was just a human being, and he lived and died in a certain time period, right? So Hegel wasn't able, and he knew this, he wasn't able and couldn't predict a lot of things that came after him. But at the same time, so I'm not so much interested in what Hegel himself thought about himself, because I don't think he really understood himself. I'm more interested in what Hegel's philosophy and the kind of arguments he's made. I'm interested in how they resonate with us in the 21st century. So, you know, with all, you know, with object-oriented ontology, new realisms, materialisms, I mean, these are very interesting and fascinating. But for example, what I tried to highlight in the presentation, at least for me, I'm not convinced that they have accounted for this, what I call this self-reflexive moment in Hegel, you know, where the text or the philosophy is aware of itself in a certain moment in time and space, and is aware of itself as having some sort of historical context, if you see what I mean. Now, I'm not saying philosophers don't think like that. Everyone does. But my point is, when you're making an argument, for example, like Milieu does, like you read Milieu, and in some sense it's historical because he talks about Kant and post-Kantianism. But the arguments he makes about the great outdoors and so on are strangely, the language he uses is strangely ahistorical and strangely, in a certain respect, transhistorical, right? He wants to get at, as he says, the great outdoors. But philosophers, as you probably well know, as everyone I would hope knows this, a lot of thinkers have thought about the outdoors for thousands of years in different ways. This term, the great outdoors, is itself a historically conditioned concept or category. It has its own history in the history of philosophy. So for me, with Hegel, so when I say self-reflexivity, I mean that in the one sense on a conceptual level, which is what I try to present in the paper, but also in a more historical and temporal level. And so, you know, as Adorno once said, you know, the question isn't, you know, is Hegel dead or alive for us today in the new century, but rather, as you know, Adorno points out, what is, how would our historical moment look to Hegel himself, or look from the perspective of his philosophy? And I think this is a very live question still. So I'm not entirely persuaded that these new forms of materialisms are successful in what they try to do, because they, at least to me, they're not able to, or they haven't accounted for their own form of subjectivity and reliance upon concept and conceptualization. Now, the thing you said about embodiment, that's interesting, because Hegel didn't care about embodiment. He thought it was, who cares? We're just stupid, fleshy, empirical animals and we die. So embodiment and movement and, for example, dance and theater and performance art, things that, forms of experiences that, in a sense, takes us out of ourselves, right? Takes us out of our own mind. Those are interesting. And that you know, the issue of embodiment and embodied experiences are important, I think. And yes, I think you're right. You know, you have that embodied experience, and then you have a kind of a concept about what it is you experience. The concept comes after, in a certain respect. But
could I jump in here?
Sorry. Yes.
Could I jump in?
Yes, of course.
On this great talk. It's been a long time since I've had to think about this in terms of the history of philosophy, which brings me to the question of the subject in a completely different sense, which is the subject of this particular philosophical investigation. And what I mean by that is that you're raising issues about the subject, the object, the concept, in a certain context with a restricted number of figures, Kant, Hegel, more recent figures. And yet there's a lot of other areas, both within and outside of philosophy, that have been addressing these kinds of issues as well. And so I'm wondering, for example, the question of embodiment. We have, for example, in the figure of someone like Bergson, someone who recognizes that human beings have a double consciousness, whereby technology has created an affect which suppresses certain aspects of cognition, and encasing it in a frame, which Kant captures nicely by establishing the a priori categories of time and space in a relational grid as structuring the intuition. But which Maimon, for example, demonstrates that that's really not in the imagination, but in the judgment, and therefore is socially constructed. And from Bergson, and I really think from Bergson, we get a tradition of phenomenology, which basically frames these set of questions in a different way. And as you know from my own interests, there is an alliance between phenomenology and cognitive science these days, what's called neurophenomenology, which addresses these issues in a hybrid way, which tries to take into account the recent history of contemporary neuroscience and empirical evidence in order to bring to bear what we actually know about the body and the brain, and the way that the body and the brain processes the world. And so I'm wondering, coming back to the subject question, is your aim simply to juxtapose these different theories, correlationism, for example, in order to advance this from the perspective of the history of philosophy, or are you attempting a new kind of model? And if you're attempting a new kind of model, how useful would it be to move away from these figures and draw on other resources in order to address the same question? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yes.
I betray my own philosophical orientation by presenting this kind of question. And you are in a program that concentrates on the history of philosophy, and I hope also the history of philosophy of science. And so I'm wondering whether the philosophy of science provides ways for you to link what is going on with these particular figures with new directions in the science. I mean, I've got all kinds of problems with the ways in which quantum mechanics gets thrown around here, and that's a really long conversation. But I'm wondering whether you ventured outside these restricted figures in order to forge your own take, if that's making sense, or are you seeing that as post-dissertation work?
Yeah, well, I mean, it'll probably be something I'll do after my thesis, PhD thesis. But I mean, no, I to answer your initial question, I'm not. So this article that I wrote about this isn't. No, it's not meant to assert a new model of materialism. I mean, I am more in agreement with people like, and I mentioned them, Žižek and Frank Ruda, who kind of emphasize, okay, this kind of idealism versus materialism distinction is a bit outdated and unhelpful and so on. So I'm not necessarily looking to have a new concept of dialectical materialism or something like this. Maybe I'll return to this topic in more detail after my PhD defense, you know, after I finish my studies. I'm not sure. But really, this article is just kind of meant to highlight what I think is maybe just one kind of lack of self awareness, if you want to call it that, or lack of self-reflexive awareness on a conceptual level in Milius's philosophy. I mean, on the one hand, it's not that I mean, at the end of the day, I'm something of a Hegelian Marxist, whatever that term means, and that's a longer discussion. But for me, it's not just about philosophical problems. I mean, these are very big philosophical problems, of course, but there's a political angle to all of this as well.
What do we do with it?
Yes. And well, what are the political implications of this stuff? And as I said last week, there are some, Andreas Malm wrote a book where he kind of said, look, if the issue, because one of the arguments that people give for decentering the subject in our ways of thinking is because of the environment and so on, the kind of climate crisis. And politically, I'm kind of in agreement with that in one sense, which is, yes, we have to recognize that human beings created capitalism. Capitalism is essentially killing a lot of the planet, and it's getting inhospitable to us as a species and so on. So we have to fix that, right? So in that sense, we don't have to be anthropocentric. I agree. However, politically, and I said this last week, politically, I don't think the solution is to what? To not emphasize the role of the human subject? Because if capitalism is made by human beings, and human beings are kind of responsible for its destruction, or the destruction that it's what's the word? The destruction that it's causing in the world, let's say, to the environment, then surely, and this is Andreas Malm's argument, then surely the political solution would be human beings using their political will to enact political change to curb the damage to the environment. Number one, right? I mean, we can't rely on nature to come back and fight capitalism or something like this. So politically, I'm not really convinced that a de-centered or a de-subject-centered philosophy where it doesn't center the subject, I'm not sure politically that makes sense if we're talking about climate change. Now, people might have different views on this, and I mean, I'm not trying to paint all of this with the same brush. I know there are many different. Right, Lily just said that Karen Berard's intra-action is a great way of decentering the subject without taking away its agency. Okay, well, great. I mean, I like that. That's fine. But I mean, I haven't read Karen Berard in too much detail, so I'm not going to speak about her theory. But I would be interested in what she actually presents. But to answer your question, Martin, sorry, I'll quickly wrap up. So no, this isn't like a bigger project really. And I'm aware of Bergson and Deleuze and other thinkers that have thought about these problems from a very different tradition. And I like Bergson very much, but not for the same reasons that I like Hegel. So they're different types of fruits, as it were. But yes, I hope that answers your question.
Could I just jump in there, Borna? So I think you kind of, I take it as a bit of an invitation or a provocation that you said that I want to have, the Marxists coming at me and posing these questions. So, but I just want to, there's a lot of, there's a lot of difficulty, I think, articulating sort of the Marxist critique of Hegel, right? And I think a lot of that owes to the fact that, in some ways, Marx is not completely off base about Hegel, but I do think that there's a sense in which he misinterprets certain aspects of his thought. I mean, we've discussed this before, and you've said, well, I think productively, and I would agree with that. But I think that means that someone attempting to sort of renew or re-examine the Marxist critique of Hegel today, in a certain sense, they have to extrapolate from it, but also perhaps take it in different directions, right? Or be a little bit more definitive about its expression. I mean, one thing that I think, if we're trying to understand perhaps, and Lily had some very, I think, interesting points and suggestions maybe about the limitations of Hegelian thought. I mean, Hegel's a remarkably evasive and permissive sort of thinker, right? In the way that, there's a certain brilliance there where it's very, very hard to critique Hegel, right? Without, sort of ending up falsifying the critique itself. And this has to do with, like what you said, the way that his system is not sort of determinate, but deeply kind of temporal in structure, right? That's where a lot of this flexibility comes from. But I guess one thing I sort of see, I think, within Hegel's thought, we often talk about Marx kind of turning Hegel right side up. And sometimes I wonder if these kind of metaphors aren't a little bit diversionary. I think, I mean, I think one thing about Marx is that he sort of starts his career, right? And he kind of takes this sort of Schellingian or Feuerbachian gesture of saying, well, all of Hegel's dialectic really indexes to the subject itself, right? Like, for example, in Feuerbach, when religion is discussed by Hegel, it's really about the interiority of the subject, right? But at a certain point, that's also quite an essentialist discourse, in a way, right? So at a certain point, Marx actually sort of departs from that and goes back to Hegel. But what I want to suggest is that in Marx's work, I think, we know that in Hegel, you have this transition that's demarcated between the phenomenology and the logic, right? This, and, in nature and spirit, right? You have these subsequent stages that are sort of broached. And there are a lot of moments in Hegel's thought where he seems to understand the sort of preconditions of the kind of process of reasoning that's described in his book. So at the beginning of The Science of Logic, for example, he talks about how in ancient Egypt, it wasn't until, they had priests who were sort of supported as a caste kind of ideologists, right, that we had the beginning of philosophy, right? So there are these kind of acknowledgements. But I think that because Marx sort of lived through this dramatic scientific revolution that took place in the 19th century, I think one thing is that Hegel can never fully, he can never fully understand the way that the sort of model that he propounds and the view of reason that he propounds is conditioned by certain historical and economic structures, right? So he pursues phenomenology, you know, into the terrain of the logic, right? But then thought is never adequately relativized itself, right? You know, in relation to history and economy, for example, right? And I think that, you know, and one consequence of this is that, you know, and of course there's a sense in which it's imminent and eligible to, you know, it can be revised. But I think, you know, most egregiously, and it's a very interesting text that people should read, but I think most egregiously, you know, if you look at something like the philosophy of nature, you can really see these limitations where there's a certain kind of transcendental narcissism, right, in the text, where Hegel's tendency to, you know, take sort of to draw these parallels, right, between kind of the negativity in reality and the negativity in the subject, is pursued too much from the side of a subject which is not sufficiently relativized, right? And that actually means that there are mistakes, and sometimes he goes too hasty, right, in doing that. So again, I think if I'm going to say, you know, what does Marxism have to offer to Hegel, I think in a certain way it's a kind of radicalization of Hegel. But I'm not sure if I'm totally comfortable with the idea, because this is sort of Žižek's take. Now, Žižek reads, you know, Hegel via Lacan, obviously. And it's a sort of ontologization of Lacan, right? But I'm not totally comfortable with this idea, which we see in the master-slave dialectic, whereby materialism is claimed, but only from the side of idealism, right? And that's ultimately what we get with people like Žižek and Badiou, right? Well, they'll say like we're materialists, but if you look at the edifice of their thought, it's quite idealist in a way. But then it's about the way that thought or reason can sort of appropriate what we call like a material train of inquiry, right? But again, I think what Marx is actually attempting is a more thorough relativization of the role of reason and thought, right? Then that could do justice to. So that would be my 2 cents on that.
Thanks. Well, I'm wondering. Well, I have 2 issues, and the issues might be just clarification questions for you. I'm wondering in what sense you are using the term relativization when you were speaking about, you know, when you're speaking about Hegel's philosophy in relation to what Hegel himself discussed in the philosophy of nature and so on. So that would be one question, because I'm not sure what you mean by that. And I would also maybe want to know, well, to your last point, which is the kind of topic of my paper, right? Well, if you show me a form of materialist philosophy, sorry, my phone is angry with me. It's running out of batteries. Bear with me here while I try to fix it. Where did this thing go? Right, so, I mean, what I tried to highlight in the presentation was that Marx's materialism, you know, he for him, as you know, the material is not something to be found in thinking or just the activity of mental thinking for Marx, right? It's the human activity aspect of it. And my point in the paper was that this isn't so anathema to Hegel as many people would like to think, right? It's only anathema to Hegel if you think of Hegel as being Kant, which is being a subjective idealist, where everything is subjective idealism, but this isn't Hegel's position. So, so in a certain, so you know, so yes, okay, maybe Badiou and Žižek, maybe their forms of materialism is a bit of an idealism. But my question would be, well, as opposed to what? As opposed to a Marxist materialism? Well, Marx, as you know, right, he emphasizes human activity, human praxis as being the ground of as he says, a scientific socialism, a scientific form of material, material, not philosophy, because Marx calls it a dialectical form of materialism, right? He, as you know, he uses Hegel's dialectical method and applies it to human history, material conditions, social relations, and so on. So in this sense, I think Marx adds a lot to Hegel, not just, like, I'm not saying, oh, look how Hegelian Marx is. I'm saying, no, look what Marx does. You know, he shows where he shows where Hegel doesn't go far enough, which is Hegel doesn't, unfortunately, which is the genius of Marx, I think. Hegel does not extend a notion of materialism to human activity, to human social relations, to human praxis. So Hegel doesn't do as Marx does. But the key for me is that Marx does this through dialectical thought. He doesn't he doesn't negate dialectical methodology, right? Marx adopts it. He just says, okay, Hegel is too idealist. I'm going to use the dialectical method. Great. More dialectics for everyone, right? Because the point about dialectics is that you're aware of contradictions and you can try to overcome them or sort them out, which is my problem with forms of materialism that aren't dialectical. For example, Neurophenomenology, in some respect. It might be speculative, but he's certainly not dialectical. So, so I would agree with that aspect of what you said. To your point about, you know, Hegel doesn't temporalize or historicize his own philosophy. Well, that's not so clear. In some respects, he does, but it's ambiguous. So in the text, well, yes. Well, I mean, this is also what I'm writing in my dissertation at the moment, actually, is the tension in Hegel between historicity and eternity, right? Yeah. Because Hegel is not entirely, because what he says is these two things, he says, you know, eternity, which by eternity means the absolute idea and all his concepts. Eternity is not reducible to history entirely. But he says it's not outside or beyond history either. And of course, you know, Jesus Christ's death on the cross for Hegel is when eternity becomes historical. So the two collapse into one. So the question for Hegel's own system, you know, as Hegel says, remember, for Hegel, the history of philosophy is the absolute coming into itself, right? Expressing itself. So the two things are kind of identical, and I think it's a mistake to try to divorce them too much. Anyway, I believe we're running out of time, and I'm running out of batteries on my phone. So we'll have to end it here. But if you have more questions, we can maybe discuss this on another Zoom call or on chat or something on Facebook if people want to continue the discussion. But thank you very much.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah, thanks everyone for joining us, and thanks for Borna for the amazing discussion. And,
great.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for hosting.